Thank you. How many attended the session earlier? Okay, if you did not, and you have an interest in classical education and special needs, then I would encourage you to watch that session that will be available to you through the conference, the access that they will give you, because that really was our session to set the framework for which all of our remaining sessions will take place. All of our remaining sessions will be largely question and answer. My daughter is coming around with two things. One is an index card. If you did not receive an index card already and fill it out in the first session, then please do so now. What we need on there is your school name, the full school name, your name. You can include your email if you would like to be contacted. And then just write down the need that you have. Basically the need that brought you to this session. So your school name and your name, your email if you'd like to share that, and then the need that brought you here. If you already filled out one in the first session, I have that whole stack, and you are set. The other thing that she was giving out, but it looks like she might have run out, is our Simply Classical Journal. It is a magazine that's free. We have more of them over in the special needs section. Kathy is holding them up. Now, those are free to take home. The articles are encouraging. It's also our catalog, so it shows you all of the resources that are now available for special needs. In this session, called Master Teachers, Struggling Students, we're going to talk about the actual situations that you all are encountering. The format will be question and answer. We have an extra microphone at the ready. When my daughter is finished handing out the magazines, she will be the one to run around with the microphone. The reason we're going to do it this way is so that anyone accessing the recordings will be able to hear what the question is without my needing to repeat it after you ask it. So be thinking, what would you like to leave this conference knowing? What problems would you like solved? I work with classical schools. I love equipping schools to meet the needs of students who are struggling at no fault of their teachers. They simply are struggling students. So be thinking what you would like to ask to get the discussion started. And Michelle, can you come on up? In just a second, she said. Okay, who would like to start us off with a question about your school, your classroom, a particular student? Raise your hand if you would like to start. Okay, just look for the hands.
So my question is...
Could you stand too? I forgot to say that.
Oh, sure, no problem. My question is tied to, I've got several, but one is just a quick, simple one. What do you do with, say, kids that are behind and they're reading quite a bit? I'm thinking of a couple of my kiddos, my actual personal biological adopted kiddos who are 6 and 7 and can't read yet. So how do you handle that in the classical model, which is obviously heavily dependent on reading?
Okay, so the student is in a school, I assume.
Homeschooled, actually.
Homeschooled. Homeschool, way easier. because you simply target the reading, especially at that early age, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's very tempting, and I know it is, to go ahead and be and kind of jump into all the wonderful parts of a classical education. You want to teach them all about ancient Greece and ancient Rome and art and music, and those are important, but we also have to really dig into reading, writing, spelling in those early years.
So then practically, are there certain resources that work better than others? Is it just finding something that works with that individual child?
Practically, there are a lot of resources for helping a child learn to read. There are some that are targeting children with, say, profound dyslexia, where that's been identified, and they're super expensive and time intensive, but they do work. There are also our own Simply Classical materials that, if you look at simplyclassical.com or the front of those manuals, you'll see reading assessments. So you just take this free reading assessment. Actually, we have assessments in all areas, so spelling and math and writing. Then you know where to start, and you just start them right there in that spot. I think I did mention in the first session that what we have done is we've taken phonics, we've taken pre-phonics first, like the ear training to learn to listen to rhyme, so that when you're working with word families, you're prepared. The at, cat, sat, and then the letter sound correspondence, the blending. We've taken all of that and kind of stretched out the time that we spent with it. Those would be our level C, that's learning letters and sounds, readiness. And then we move to levels 1, 2, and 3, which are all focused on reading. So that 6, 7 age is perfect. If you need the full program, we have phonics and reading and spelling that all coordinate. Also, take a look at Storytime Treasures and more Storytime Treasures that are over there. They're Simply Classical resources. And those can be a great help at teaching composition, early oration. We have some oral language too, but we have phonics built in. We do a lot of pre-reading before they encounter the words in print. So in a homeschool setting, you have that flexibility to spend the time that you need on those foundations. And I'd be happy to show you exactly what we're talking about. But everything is at simplyclassical.com, even the readiness assessments. You just look for where do I start? And you scroll down to the assessments. Schools can use these too, of course. At intake time, you can use those assessments to know, is this student really going to be able to keep up in third grade reading or third grade spelling, or is he going to need some targeted remediation? Yes.
One question that I've struggled with different teachers over the years. Oh, sorry. Over the years at different schools is when you do have a struggling student, let's say learning challenge, disability, how do you as a teacher teach to the entire class, especially in a classical setting, without being too time intensive on those ones that really struggle?
That really is the most common question for a classical school. And honestly, the answer is often an administrative answer rather than a teacher answer. If you have 20 students in your classroom, some of our classical schools are that large, then it's very difficult to help the one student learn how to read when the others are already reading. That's where the school needs to come together, form a committee if necessary, and figure out what are we going to do. It's often not just one student. What are we going to do with these students that need extra help, and we know they do. We don't want to just pass them along. We want to help them. So the key is thinking of it in two parts. We have remediation and we have accommodation. I think that the pendulum has swung in special ed too far to accommodation. The accommodations are things like we won't ask them to read, and we won't ask them to write. We will have someone else take notes for them, or they will just sort of audit the class. That's the accommodation that lets them stay in the classroom. But that's not our whole goal, is to have them just stay in the classroom. So the remediation has to happen at some point. It can be through tutoring. That's happening a lot in our classical schools. That can be in the mornings or the afternoons. It can be during a class that maybe he's just not able to handle. Maybe he's not able to do Latin yet because his English phonics are not strong enough. So it's confusing when he's still learning that an A can say its name, and then an A always says in Latin. But so maybe that's a time to pull him out, as long as you still give him Latin when he's ready. It just may be a little bit later. Some schools are creating resource room settings. There may be one teacher or one parent in your community that has a heart for such students and maybe some background. You could have a half-day program in some room that maybe is available. That person could work with those students.
Very helpful, thank you.
We are not here to burden teachers who are already working so hard. A lot of things can happen in the classroom, but sometimes it's time to say, we have an administrative situation here, and maybe we have so many students who need this that we need to create even a bridge year or a bridge class. We just did that for a school in Houston. It's a classical school. They had so many students who were really not ready for third. I don't know how many know the Memorial Press curriculum. It is set up where K through 2 is really primary. We're working on the pencil grip. We're working on getting reading solid, spelling, the phonics so solid that then you're ready to tackle that. And in third grade, it's kind of a jump. So if you're not there yet, and you go into MP third, Memorial Press third, where you're doing Latina Christiana, a little heavier Latin, then you can really start to see some gaps forming. So they just formed a second, third bridge class. And this past year, they have used the Simply Classical materials in order to keep them from having to just repeat second. They didn't want to do that. They wanted something that would stretch those students and help them to bridge across to then going on to the regular curriculum.
Do you have resources for students that are behind in speech, like incoming, like we have junior K students, as our youngest. Do you have any kind of resources to help with speech therapy style teaching, where the students are behind? Like, this is close to our heart, because I have a 3-year-old and she was born deaf, and through the grace of God, she can hear now with hearing aids, but her speech development is behind. And she is in speech therapy, but it's twice a week outside of her daycare, and trying to prepare her to enter into classical teaching. Do y'all have any type of resources or knowledge on that subject?
Often what we try to do is to have the speech person come into the school. In some states that becomes possible, so that the child is receiving more. But we do, our level B is all about ear training. It's called Essentials, Ear Training, and Etiquette. They all have a threefold, either alliteration or essence title. The level B is readiness. It's right at that same age. If you have oral recitations, which we include, along with the poetry that they're exposed to teach rhyming, and that ear training to distinguish the sounds, then that can be helpful. We have at the front also speech and language suggestions. We have fine motor suggestions, social emotional, kind of behavioral suggestions, language, cognitive suggestions that you can do just in your leisure time. But what I would do is pair with the speech and language therapist, which I needed to do for my own son, and just say, I will do anything. We will do homework. Give me homework. She did. It made a huge difference. He went from a very low intelligibility to graduating from speech therapy. It's always something that he has to be conscious of. He revisits speech therapy even now as a young adult, just to remember that his volume, his rate, and his diction, they all have to be there. And he has to consciously attend to those things. Because that will probably always be a lifelong thing, but it is a wonderful thing to work on, because when you're working on speech, you can also be working on phonics and vice versa. So then when he's finished with B, he can go on to C, or level C teaches the alphabet. That one is alphabet, animals, and Aesop. We work on letters and sounds. We even have flashcards. They're just perfect for speech work too. So take a look at B and C. And then again, ask the speech therapist, send things home, tell me what to do every day, because it needs to be daily, as you know. One thing we did too, we always tried to get the most for our time, so putting a lot of things together. I was teaching my son the Lord's Prayer. I had him use that as his speech exercise so that it wasn't all mumbled together, but that every word was paused between as he was memorizing. So you can integrate the speech things that you know he needs to work on in with other subjects.
Okay, so I'm the head of a school, and my question is, do y'all have any screening and evaluation resources available for schools at this point?
Now, this is screening to see if the child might have, say, dyslexia or something like that. I think the biggest thing that we have that would help would be those readiness assessments, because you could say, here's where our average student is in his classroom, and here's where he falls. This is a large enough gap to make us think that it might be worth your time to pursue this if your insurance covers it. So often that can be enough of a nudge. They maybe have been thinking about it already, that then they can go and get that professional and formal evaluation.
You spoke briefly about having an entire resource room dedicated to, say, using assembly classical materials. I wondered if you could speak to how you would envision seeing that running alongside regular classroom instruction, particularly if the class is not using all of, say, Memorial Press curriculum. Have you seen that work? Have you seen individual students follow that course of curriculum, of course, as closely aligned as possible with what the class is doing, or has it mostly been exclusively done as a group of students using assembly class?
Well, I will say that everything is being done everywhere. People are getting very creative and using whatever resources they have. It looks so different in every school. Just during lunch, I was talking with someone who is an upper school humanities teacher, and yet 1 hour a week, 1 hour a day, 1 hour of his day, he works one-on-one with a math student in upper school whose math is lower, and she just needs that kind of intensive math instruction. And she's also going to get math during the summer, and they expect her to be caught up. And lo and behold, the next year she will be able to go on to join her fellow students. It's not a different curriculum, it's a different level of the curriculum. just innovative sorts of, let's just make this work. And I have an extra hour in my day, and I'm not that strong in math, but I can do one-on-one, and so that's what I'm going to do. So, resource room. We have seen, there's one in a school in California that I've worked closely with. For reading, she has a special ed background. She brought some of her own favorite things, like for fluency. She's a data collecting type person. She likes to chart their fluency and see it grow. So she brought her own fluency program, and that's what she likes to use. Then she pulled some of our classical phonics, our storytime treasures. She worked with those with some students. There's one student who is in 6th grade, he has Down syndrome. He came down to her for reading Little Bear, books like that. And that worked fine because it was so different from the regular curriculum. His math is also ours. But then there are other times where they're going to be integrated back. So the best thing in that setting is to have the regular curriculum be taught in that resource room, but just more intensively. So in other words, it can work either way. It kind of depends on the student. We see, for the most part, the best use of the Simply Classical is either a bridge to help the student get on with the curriculum that the rest of the school is using, or a side-by-side program taught as a parallel to the curriculum that you're using. Because you already identified the difficulties of having two different curricula. The other thing, though, that can be helpful is a summer program. So using our spelling or our writing, especially Simply Classical Spelling 1 and 2 and Writing 1 and 2, those tend to cover things that other programs just don't. Because in most programs, you go from phonics to being expected to go very quickly through a list of spelling scope and sequence. But we've pulled out that part, so the tutoring can be helpful there. I hope that helps. Or do you have a follow-up?
I mean, I can come up with lots of thoughts.
Oh, I'm sure. Feel free.
What would you say, sorry, Sandy, just since you have this view of lots of different schools, homeschools, classical schools, that are either using Simply Classical or you maybe consulted with them to help with their programs, what would you say has been one or more of the most encouraging things that they've done for parents to help them in the journey?
I think the most encouraging thing for parents is to be able to allow that child to remain in the school. That it's that coming alongside the family instead of saying, these 3 children of yours can be here, but this one is going to have to go to the public school. That's the most heartbreaking thing that our schools face, especially when they're very dedicated to the Christian education of their children, of their students. To say, you have to go somewhere else, that's not something that we want. So to be able to say, we will be able to teach all of your children, that alone is so important and heartwarming, and those parents are very grateful for that. And I think just that they know that they're making that effort to keep the student there. There's one school that I've worked with for the last 3 years. What they did is they formed a committee of people who were committed to this kind of cause. Because not everyone is. You know, some of the teachers are they have kind of a passion, or maybe you're the one who has a compassion for children like this, and others just, it's fine, it's not a problem, but they're not really driven to really dive into this. Same with the administrators. So the 2 or 3 that are interested can come together and brainstorm, what are we going to do next? What do we want this to look like? You can have someone come. I came to the school. We worked for, it was a full day or maybe 2 days, just on their own situation and what they really wanted to see. Now, a few years later, they actually have a speech and language pathologist on board. They have two special services folks. They just have done so much, and they're just still growing in what they're able to do within their school and without charging extra tuition. For some schools, that's important. Other schools say these are smaller class sizes, we're going to charge more, and often parents say, that's fine, we understand that, we still want our student to come here. But in this case, they didn't have to charge more. Same with the school in California. It was just important to that headmaster that this be something that we offer. Let's have a round of applause for our microphone runner.
Question is, practically speaking, how do you bring in kids with special needs? I was talking to some of my colleagues. I kind of see it, maybe you would disagree, that there's some learning differences, you know, with dyslexia, dysgraphia, some of these auditory things, and then maybe more special needs with autism or intellectually delayed. Low IQ, those types of things. This side seems a little bit bigger on how would we integrate into our school. I have a daughter who's 13 that is in the public school because I've never thought our school could accommodate her. But you're giving me kind of a vision of course, I think we could. It would just take some creativity and some buy-in, I guess, from teachers and administration, but practically speaking, how do you bring a child that's, 13 on maybe on a level like a second grader in all aspects and lower emotionally? How do we bring those kids into our school? Do you create another classroom setting? Do you let them come in? And I don't know, just how do you do that?
Again, you would just be amazed. I wish I had the staff, the team to bring videos of what's going on in our classical schools across the country. So there's one school where there's a 13-year-old young man who has Down syndrome. He is in the 6th grade classroom. He's been there since the very beginning. It's very important to his parents. So much so that they funded the special services person to work with him. He's pulled out for that remediation part, but the special services person creates the accommodations. So say everyone in the class is working on math at a very high level. She will wipe out the sheets ahead of time, and she puts in the math that she knows that he's working on. He works on those during the independent math part, and he takes in what he can take in when he's in the classroom. They love him, and boy, he is a physical young man too. It's a school where they really prize their physical parts of a classical education, which is a wonderful resurgence to see as well. But he's way more toned than most people with Down syndrome because he plays basketball just like all the others. He is very integrated. He's also very social. When I was visiting that school, he'd come up to me and just say, "How's your day going?" just super super fun and easy to love. So you have that model. Then there's also a school. It's Trinity Classical Academy in Valencia, California, that has created a separate program just for people with intellectual disability. It's called Imago Dei, the image of God. It's parallel. Then you're still in the school culture. You have your friends who are more like you, and that also works wonderfully. There's a school in Louisville that purposefully takes students who have Down syndrome. It's a Catholic school. It's called Immaculata Classical Academy. They see the acceptance, the embracing of students with Down syndrome as a pro-life statement. They're very adamant that these children should not be aborted, and instead they should be embraced. The heads of the school, couple, they have, I think, at last count, 14 adopted children with special needs of different kinds. So for them, this is a matter of heart, philosophy. They really want integration. So they have created a model that is largely integrated from little bitty on, much easier when they're little bitty. In the later years, it becomes more difficult, but what they have gone to is the tutoring that we talked about, so that remediation component is there. The main thing is when you're talking with your administration, or you are an administrative person, is not to think that you need to accept every child that is in your community, but to first focus on the students that you have, get creative about keeping them there, keeping them taught, making sure they have an education, and then seeing if there might be something that someone is drawn to creating. It could be that you have enough people in your circles that you could start a one-day-a-week program. This happened at a school in Virginia. It is Holy Family Academy, again, a Catholic school. They have a program called St. Anne's. It was started by a kindergarten teacher who had a little brother with Down syndrome. So she started a one-day-a-week program. They teach from Simply Classical. The rest of the week, they're homeschooled. That is a nice model. It's kind of the best of both worlds. They're still in the school and of the school, but they also have that time at home or for their therapies, their doctor's appointments. It's intensive being a child with special needs. You have a lot of different places to go and things that have to be tended to. So that's a model. If the day is open, some of our schools, as you know, our classical schools are 4-day-a-week schools. So if they're Tuesday through Friday, that lends itself wonderfully to Mondays being the day of the cottage school. The tip there that we've learned is make sure that all the families are also teaching from Simply Classical so that everyone's progressing at the same time, otherwise you have gaps or differences. But if you create the one day a week, get the buy-in where everyone's teaching from the same thing the remainder of the week, but the accountability is wonderful. I would have loved something like that when I was raising my kids, for one day a week, that we could handle that. We would all come together, we'd all have the same recitations, the same maybe hymns or spiritual songs. We would study a handful of subjects, and then we would have PE and music, and physical education that is, and maybe art or whatever specialty was prevalent among those in our circles. It could be drawing, it could be anything. And then the rest of the week we were on our own. But it would have given us accountability, it would have given our children much more companionship. So that's one option. But don't think that you have to suddenly take every student with autism or every student with Down syndrome. And I will say that at Immaculata, they've been doing this a very long time. They have been, it was the very first school I visited, and it was just to observe, how are you doing this in a classical setting? They have learned that one, the student has to be able to follow the conduct requirements of the classroom. They have to be able to stay in the classroom for a full day. And two, the school does not accept more than the general population. So they have a waiting list almost always, and they just have had to put those boundaries there. It made me think, there was a school in Tulsa that was a simply classical school. This is pre-COVID. COVID came and things happened, but it was all for students who had intellectual disabilities. Some were nonverbal with autism, some had Down syndrome, some had other things. But it was started from the ground up as a special needs school, special needs classical school. Beautiful. My daughter and I went. It was just a wonderful thing to see. After lunch, they would play hymns. The students just danced and sang to those. It was a worshipful kind of a place. And then they got down to the hard work of reading, spelling, math. They had our enrichment, which is art. We have beautiful, real artwork that the students just gaze upon and talk about briefly. We have classical music woven in, literature, so they heard read-alouds. And it was just fabulous. They decided they would start as a pilot. And you can always do this too, say this is a pilot program. So they only wanted 11 students total. They had a team of volunteers. Almost every student had an adult in some capacity there. They had a PT and an OT and a speech therapist. They said 11 students. They had a waiting list of 140 or 50. A long waiting list. The need is there. The parents want to have a Christian alternative to the public schools for their students. But again, you can't take every student. There is a little book that 8th Day is carrying for us just for this conference. It's called Welcoming Children with Special Needs. Welcoming Children with Special Needs. Good for anyone who's interested in this topic. It's slim. It has just some practical things. And that's one of the things they say is don't try to do too much. Just like when you're starting a classical school. You don't start K through 12 typically. You might start with kindergarten, and then you move, or you might start with first grade and then move to second, third, etc. Or in the case of this context, you might start with high school and work down. But the same would be with any special needs program. So don't be overwhelmed, don't feel like you have to do everything or take every one. That's not the point. And there is a difference between the student who just needs a few accommodations because he's just not quite the same as everyone else in his learning or his abilities versus the student who is formally diagnosed with autism, Down syndrome, severe dyslexia, things like that.
Can I ask a quick question? Sure. As you are looking to possibly start these tracks or start these schools, if you have recommendations or training resources for teachers, grammar, but also I'm really thinking high school to help them as they start to have these children in their classes or already do, but to help them navigate and to kind of adapt to this model.
That's another great question. We have some teacher training videos. We just released a new website for schools. It is at classicallatin.org, and that you'll see on there special needs under resources. I think it is classicallatin.org/SC schools. We're hoping to add to that as more resources develop. But one thing that is very helpful is we have collected schools who are doing this well and have been doing this for a long time by region. We also have some vision statements there. We have some policy letters that have been written. There's an exceptional needs policy that I really love. This one came from a school in Georgia, a classical school in Georgia. They just called it exceptional needs policy. So what they have is not only the struggling learner or the student with special needs, they also have the exceptional, the gifted or advanced student and what their policy is there. And they'll say, in the rare occasion that your student truly needs something beyond our already rigorous and challenging program, this is what we offer. I've heard it called, what we're trying to do here, the Oxford model. That this is what used to happen. How many of you have heard of Dr. Christian Kopp? He's a classicist, he's a friend. He tells the story about how he's one of those that's in the classical genius categories, made his own translations of the Iliad, that sort of thing. When he was in high school at his classical school, he loved Latin. So a teacher took him aside and said, would you like to learn Greek? And he was just drooling with excitement. Of course I would. But they didn't offer Greek. So this teacher took him aside and taught him Greek during whatever breaks or after school or whenever that worked, because that's what he needed to be fully educated, because he was capable of doing that. So the same model applies. If our students need help learning how to read, even though they're 12, then that's what we want to provide them.
Yes, thank you for really questioning and answering. My question is, we have a school where the majority of our parents, I'd say the large majority, are working. So then doing any kind of homeschooling for the majority is simply not an option. But we're also a fairly new school. So bringing in these extra resources that will cost a lot more is also really not an option for a new school's coming. So in lieu of those two things, what other practical suggestions do you have for helping children who truly deserve this education, but maybe we don't have resources to get them what they need?
That's a wonderful and touching question. We want to do this, but we are just too small, we're too new. What do we do? Group wisdom. Does anyone have suggestions? Maybe you've been there as a school.
Okay, so one thing that we've done is, for example, I teach Latin for 3 of our grammar school classes. So those teachers have an off period during that time. Or my 4th grade teacher doesn't teach math. So every day when her students go to math for an hour, she goes down to the 1st and 2nd grade classes and pulls out our students that we know are struggling with readers right now. Well, we don't have an official program set up, but we kind of just see it organically happening without us even, doing anything. And in this conference, you're here, so, thoughts are making some things for us right now. But that's what we're doing. We're pulling our teachers when they have that available time. They're saying, where can I go and, fill a need? We're also the school that has a humanities teacher who is teaching math to one student, and our math teacher's going to work with her this summer to
That's wonderful. And another thing too that can happen is the school can rearrange how it's thinking about classes. Block scheduling is something that Immaculata has done, the school in Louisville that I mentioned. So everyone studies Latin at the same time. What that allows is the students who maybe are new to the school, they don't have to have special needs, but they're new to classical education. They've never had any Latin. They need introductory Latin, so they go at that time to introductory Latin. There might be a student who has an affinity for languages or is just particularly good at them. He's moving more quickly, so he can go to the more advanced Latin, etc. They do the same with Latin and math and literature. So what everyone knows then is that it's a fluid time. There's not a lot of stigma, nobody's being pulled out, nobody's being neglected, and yet everyone is challenged at the point that they need to be. That's an option. It can even, that literature can also be extended to reading. That's how we do reading and literature with Memoria Press. So you don't do literature until you learn to read. So reading and literature could all be taught at the same time, and then you just go where you need to be. That's a possibility for a smaller school that doesn't have staff for someone special, and also it's desirable for a lot of reasons. You don't always want to have the pull-out scenario, or you don't have the resources for aides. But then also the teacher can just teach who he needs to teach. And if you're in the introductory for 2 years, that's okay. You're still getting Latin. You're still hearing or having the benefits of all of those, all of the things that Latin is so wonderful at doing, disciplining the mind, improving vocabulary, enriching your word awareness, which our kids with dyslexia need so badly. So that's another option. And then volunteers. A volunteer aide can do wonders, just helping a student with autism to calm down. Apparently we have a volunteer aide over. Yes, so if you have a volunteer crew, treat them really well. They don't have to be paid, but that's an option too.
I would love to know what you think the grading system should look like for our students who struggle. Knowing we talk about remediation and accommodation, sometimes grades can feel just like we're accommodating or modifying for a student, but are we really assessing what they know and what standards they're getting to? So I would love to know your opinion about grading with students who struggle.
Very good. What we usually recommend is that if things have been modified so dramatically that you no longer feel like giving that A is really fair or representative, then you have to talk to the parents and say ahead of time, I'm not going to do a letter grade, I'm going to do a narrative report card assessment, or if you don't want to do narrative, then you may have to say, I'm going to give him an A, but I'm going to put in parentheses modified, because it needs to be known that there have been so many modifications for this class or for this year that we need to reflect that in some written way. The narrative is a really nice option, and a lot of lower schools just prefer it anyway, because you have issues with grades and parents and all of those things. So it can be a nice and kind of freeing way to assess anyway. And it can be the impetus to go ahead and make that shift over. But if you must do grades or you want to do grades, then having that modified connotation or denotation can help.
Nice looking at a quick one. So we've talked a lot about younger students and modification and remediation. At least it seems that's like where a lot of the questions are coming from. I'm curious, what does graduation look like for students who stay in an age-graded classroom but have remediation and accommodations? Have you seen schools graduate students who have gone through grades, staying with their classmates but doing modified learning? And what does that kind of capstone end mark look like for those students?
As with so many of these scenarios. It can depend. As you know, some schools, public schools, will keep a student until 21. Others, if the student has true organic special needs, if that's the option, then it could be deferred. It can be a deferred graduation, if that's the choice. Or if 18 is the goal and all the classmates are also graduating, then again, you could have a modified diploma. You can obtain diplomas from wherever you normally obtain them, but you can have a notification on there that there were modifications made so that he's still graduating, but it's also recognized that this was a modified program if you feel like you should do that to be representative. But the graduation could look similar, even though perhaps he's not finished, he hasn't gone through the entire program. That's where the modifications would come in. And then also, at that point, you don't want the family to feel like he has just fallen off a cliff with his education. So you can then point them to things like Simply Classical. One of our wonderful uses that I've seen is for children who still need something. They still, not children, but young adults. Both of my kids are that way. We still want them to be reading good literature and to be studying Latin or music or history. So we still have assignments in our home. We have a chart, they have their chore chart, things they have to do, but then they have their challenge chart to also make sure that they are still enriching themselves and being enriched as young adults, because you can see regression happen really quickly with these young folks if they just end up in a day program, for example, or a sheltered workshop. It's not nearly the same as your classical education that you've been giving them. So you can, we actually have a list at the end of our last one. We have a list for where to go next, but it could be anywhere on the spectrum of the curriculum that you recommend to the parents. Do things from this after graduation with the student, no matter where he goes, if he works at the grocery store or wherever, but you can still enrich his mind. He's not done. He may not be able to go to college, but you don't have to call the education finished at all. I wish I had done that. One of my kids' doctors said, Cheryl, you're done. It's like, I don't feel done. But you're done, just stop. They need to move on. Well, so then we had Michelle go to an adult day program, and it was nice. She was kind of a helper, also a helper person, but if you've seen her poetry books, her poetry writing was at a very high level. We started to see that diminish. So we just saw some other things too, where we thought we have to pull her from this and give her something else. Not everyone can do that, but we were able to do that and assign her Shakespeare. Get back into your Shakespeare. Get back into reading George Herbert. I bought her the book, The Soul in Paraphrase, I think. You're probably familiar with that. If not, you would enjoy that. It's Christian-themed poetry, sacred poetry through the ages. And I think that that's not just George Herbert. I think that's a whole group of poetry, but that was a birthday gift for her. We've got a big book of operas. She loves operas. She's laughing. It's like 101 operas or something like that, and ballets, just so it continues to be an enriching life even after graduation. That's what I would point them to.
For many teachers, it might be a little bit daunting to have students in a class who are struggling, especially if they don't have a background. So how do you get teacher buy-in and encourage the teachers?
Yes, and that goes to a question that I think was only partially answered the training for teachers. So one, obviously, if you're using Simply Classical, it's open and go. You have everything that you need. But if you need to be training teachers, what has worked well is to find someone in your area that has the background and is more the how-to kind of person. Someone who can say, this is what it feels like to have auditory processing difficulties. Do the simulations, do the list of strategies. Here are some easy things to do that won't take a lot of your time. This is a way that you can help. If you have those people come in, that's what happened to this one school in Cleveland. They identified some local people who were really good at that sort of thing to just come in and do some in-service. They knew that professional development was going to be a huge component of success. So you have to make that part of your plan. Also, there's a little website, understood.org, that has a lot of really helpful videos on what is it like to have dyslexia, or what is dysgraphia. You hear about that. That's the one where you have difficulties with writing. You can just, in a teacher's meeting, you can play those little videos. They're free to have some, I guess, cultivate some compassion. But then the other thing, and we only have a couple more minutes, the other thing that I learned in my very first job out of graduate school, I had a master's degree in learning disabilities, a bachelor's in behavior disorders, and I was assigned to a public school with 12 elementary schools. This was when mainstreaming was just coming into fashion. We had 3 self-contained classrooms of students with behavior disorders, and the goal was to empty 2 of them. So I was to identify the most likely to succeed students from these very challenged and challenging classrooms, and then place them with teachers. And I'm, 22 myself. So what I learned very quickly is that if a teacher does not want to do this, the teacher will sabotage it. Just don't even attempt that without that teacher buy-in. Especially if you have the flexibility in your school, say you have 2 second grade teachers, see who may be more likely to accept the student. But then the other thing is the person might not know about special needs, but they may be just a very orderly teacher who speaks slowly, carefully, who's willing to have everything be very predictable, the kind of person that says, in 5 minutes, we will be going to. Those were the teachers where the kids just thrived. I was able to put anybody in that classroom because it was, the doors were closed. They didn't have, when they studied oceans, they didn't have plankton hanging all over the ceiling. You can kind of tell which teachers are going to be more successful with which students. We will talk more in our next 2 sessions, so if you have more questions, I'm sorry, I took the microphone right out of her hand. But we do need to wrap up. People are waiting for the room. But thank you very much for your interest. It's so encouraging to me.